by 12%, or by more than 27,000 students over this same time period. Display 3 is a table that focuses just on staff only, because a lot of the attention has been focused on growth in staff. We have broken this out into 3 major categories: those that are health sciences, at our medical centers and health sciences schools. As you can see, staff growth in these areas reflects demand for health care. These employees are primarily not paid with state funds or tuition. Those increased by 14% over that period. The next category are student workers, and these would be students that work in our bookstores, dining halls, libraries. Many of them are supported as work-study students by receiving some funding from the federal government. The growth in this area has reflected a growth in the student population and also increased financial need among our students. That grew about 30%, but you can see it's on a fairly small base in terms of overall FTE. The last category, general campus staff, would encompass all other staff on our campuses, including staff members in a biology department or employees who manage the financial aid program or custodial workers. The staff growth in this area, which was just 6% during this time, primarily reflects increases in student enrollment and the commensurate services that support their education. The bulk of this growth has been in self-supporting areas such as our residential and dining services and research contracts and grants. And you can see that this area grew at a far lower rate than the rate in student workers or health sciences workers. Display 4 at the bottom of this page, again, this demonstrates the sources of funds that are used to support general campus staff. As you can see, the amount of staff that's supported by core funds, that is the state general fund and tuition, has decreased significantly. All staff growth that occurred happened on non-core funds. So while overall general campus staff grew by 6%, those funded with core funds decreased by 18%, reflecting the depths of cuts that the campuses had to take during the recession. Another way of representing the funds that are used to support general campus staff is shown in Display 5. On the far right, you can see that there are far fewer staff, nearly 20% fewer, that are supported by state general funds and tuition dollars in 2014 than in 2007. The chart's also valuable if you're interested in seeing the breakdown of fund sources for other employment categories. Modest growth in academic employees and student workers coinciding with an increase in student enrollment. Much more substantial increase in health sciences. Again, across all these categories, as you can see in the yellow bar, growth only occurred on non-core funds, and core-funded staff actually decreased. The committee had also requested a breakdown of the 3 main personnel categories that UC uses to classify all of our non-academic personnel. Display 6 on page 4 breaks these down, these 3 personnel categories that are used for all general campus staff, including staff at the Office of the President. The first major category, the senior management group, consists of the President, the chancellors, and other senior executives. They represent less than 1% of general campus staff, and this number has decreased by 9% since October 2007. The next category is MSP, stands for managers and senior professionals. These are mid-level managers and professional staff who perform highly skilled services. They can be grouped again into managers and then technical and professional staff. And the technical professional staff include senior IT programmers, lawyers, auditors, architects, engineers, and other professional staff on our campuses. And growth in this staff, which has been about 1,000 employees during this time, reflects not only growth in enrollment, but also the further professionalization of the workforce. It's similar to changes that we've seen in the wider labor market over the past 7 years. And then the final category is professional and support services, commonly called support staff, which includes clerical, IT desk support, lab technicians, police officers, and others. And once again, it's important to identify the source of funds that are used to support these general campus staff, which is, again, display 7 on page 5. The chart, again, shows a sharp decline in the amount of FTE staff that are supported by state general funds and tuition. In summary, I'd like to emphasize the 3 points we started with. The growth in staff across the entire university has largely mirrored the modest growth we've had in academic personnel, even though we had enrollment growth of 27,000 during that time. Staff growth during that period has been concentrated in self-supporting enterprises such as our teaching hospitals and other areas that receive no state funds and no tuition dollars. And then finally, our general campus staff that are supported by these general funds have actually declined during the period that the committee is reviewing. And Chair McCarty, I might return to something that you had mentioned in your opening comments. And when we put together the 5-year sustainability plan for the President, one of the things that she insisted on is that we keep administrative staff, those administrative staff sponsored by general funds, flat over the 5-year period, even though we are anticipating increases in enrollment. So to the extent that that is a concern of the committee, we have incorporated that into our funding model and would be using that in all future planning. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions in this specific area.
Okay, we'll proceed now with LAO. Hold it real quick, and we're going to call the roll.
Mr. McCarty.
Here.
Mr. Chavez.
Here.
Mr. Ting.
Here.
Quorum is established.
Okay.
Paul Goluszewski with the Legislative Analyst Office. So as you heard, the issue before you involves staff growth at UC, and as Mr. BudSub testified, staff encompass a wide range of categories of employees. Essentially, it's any non-academic employee who would be typically your faculty and your librarians. But staff could include campus presidents, accountants, clerical staff, groundkeepers. All of these are lumped together sort of under the umbrella term of staff. We'd have a couple of points just to make. Staff growth and enrollment growth, you wouldn't necessarily expect to track one for one. So, for instance, if you had a 1% increase in enrollment, you wouldn't necessarily expect a 1% increase in executive managers. So that's just one example. Another would be you wouldn't necessarily expect staff that are not heavily involved in the instructional portion of the university to increase necessarily. So, for example, you might not expect certain research staff to increase. But generally, as enrollment grows, you would expect staff to grow somewhat. For instance, more students would mean more staff to manage financial aid records, more classrooms to clean, things like that. Because the state no longer uses enrollment growth funding, as you've heard in previous hearings, really it hasn't set any expectations for how staff or academics should change as enrollment changes. So, for instance, the state, when it provided enrollment growth funding in the past, used to exclude some staff, such as executives, in the funding formula. But the state no longer provides that in its funding model for UC. So it's not entirely clear what the expectations are for staff growth at the university currently. If you turn on page 4 of your agenda, and it's also included on page 4 of the handout that UC provided, there is a chart that tracks staff growth by certain categories compared to enrollment growth. And as you heard, enrollment growth had increased 12% and staff growth had increased 6% overall. And if you look at the far right column, there's some changes according to the different categories, and these are pretty broad categories again: executives, managers, technical professional staff, and then support staff, which is by far the largest. And the percent changes are not too notable, all under 10%, except for the one category of technical and professional staff. Is the only one that sort of jumps out as far out of line with what the enrollment growth was. UC, as you heard, explains this by talking about how their staff has become more professionalized due to changing labor markets, but it's not clear to us exactly what this means. And I think for you to understand, it could be helpful if you wanted to ask the university to provide additional detail on why exactly they feel that their staff needs to be more professionalized these days. And furthermore, it would be helpful, I think, since these are sort of broad brush categories, if you were interested in understanding a little better, you might need to request information, more specific information on exactly what categories of employees are included in the technical and professional staff label. It could include auditors, lawyers, coaches, IT professionals. These are examples UC gave, but we don't sort of have the breakout to know exactly which types of staff we're growing. In terms of the issue regarding core funds versus other fund sources that UC mentioned, we had sort of, in I think your initial hearings, we had questioned this issue of core funds, and I think also your staff in your agenda has raised this question again. The definition of what's a core fund was developed many, many years ago and hasn't been revisited a lot in recent years. And it could be an opportunity as part of your budget process this year to think about it. There's not necessarily any real magic between what's a core fund and a non-core fund. There are some funds that the university has that are legally restricted and can only be used for certain purposes, but there's others that aren't considered core funds that could be generally available for the instructional program. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, Department of Finance.
Thank you. Christian Osmenu with Finance. I think the administration concurs with the committee's focus on administrative costs and staff growth at the UC. We'd concur with a lot of the issues that have been raised. It's a complicated issue for at least a few different reasons. One is the definitional issues that the LAO has raised. They've pointed out in your agenda the distinction between core funds and non-core funds. I think the other issue that we haven't talked a whole lot about is this idea of tenured and tenure-track faculty. Your item notes the relative growth of tenured and tenure-track faculty versus other kinds of faculty. And that group, in the employees included in tenure and tenure-track faculty are really two different kinds of employees. You have your traditional professor series, and you also have lecturers, or a term at UC, lecturer with security of employment or lecturer with potential security of employment, that perform really two different functions. Your professors are individuals with responsibility for both teaching and research. Your lecturers with security of employment are responsible for primarily instructional activities. And so to the extent that we make we believe that the percent of tenure and tenure-track faculty is an important part of instructional quality. I think it's one of these areas where I think diving down into more detail about where you want that growth and what proportion your lecturers versus your professors, I think, is an important part of the conversation. I would just note, I think the second reason this is kind of an important, a complicated discussion is your agenda asks, should you slow this growth? And I think the challenge here is a set of decisions related to how many employees and how many administrators and staff you have at a campus are made at all different levels at the campuses. The Office of the President makes some decisions, but many are made by campus administrators, department administrators. So it's a complicated conversation about how you think about how to actually control that growth and what is the structure at the university and the incentives for different actors at the university to control that growth. I think we'd concur with most of the points, and we're happy to take any other questions.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to do a 5-minute recess real quick, a little timeout, so we can go run up to the Education Committee and come back. Unfortunately, we have 5 members of this committee and 4 of us are on that committee, so we're going to go there and vote and come all right back. So.
Good discussion.
Okay, we will reconvene on this hearing in the panel on admin and personnel costs. Do we have any comments or questions from committee members on this section? Mr. Chavez.
We started this back in February.
manufacturing. And in fact, one of our campuses is taking on a pilot. They'll be the first, it's UC Riverside. They're going to be looking at activity-based costing within one of their colleges this fall to really delineate what you're saying is what is the cost of different types of courses, what's the cost of doing a lecture course, what's the cost of doing seminars, what's the cost of doing online and flipped. So we'll have that as an increasing management tool. I mean, it's tough to do because there's a lot of data entry and timekeeping, but I think it's a very valid concern and something that I think we're pioneering.
I'm just trying to think logically, because we had that big discussion back in February, and we all had, all these, I had some guy in here, professor, telling this thing. So there was a big discussion, and so I was waiting to see what was going to come out of this, and now we got this. So I'm correct in saying this is a follow-on from that discussion. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was just presenting more data and breaking up the fund sources and delineating where the growth in staff had occurred at the university. But I think your question is more seminal. Is what does it actually cost to put on a course, and are there ways that we can control those costs or produce the same outcomes at lesser cost?
Okay, just want to know. Yeah. Okay, because to me this is just stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of stuff and numbers, we have lots of numbers going back and forth from our agenda and yours and the LAO. And I guess I ask you a question, just a simplistic question: is do you think that the university is at the right number as far as admin folks? Bureaucrats that you have there with the university, the UC office of the president. Are you at the right number, or do you think, does the president think that there's more efficiencies to be made, and you could further right-size the system to further provide resources for your academic mission in serving students?
Yeah, I think it's something that we will need to be continuously looking at, and I think she has made that commitment in this next 5-year plan of keeping staff flat, even though we are going to be growing in the number of students, in the number of faculty. We plan to increase both enrollment and also increase faculty, but keep administrative staff flat. A lot of that is going to happen through technological innovations. I mean, we are underway with doing a system-wide payroll and HR process that will go live at UCOP in September. I think those are the types of things that we'll use as a springboard for further reductions or getting more productivity out of existing staff. I think there are some areas of our campuses that are understaffed. I think especially in some of the areas that you had highlighted in student services. There were lots of cuts that we took during the recession that have not been restored, that I think would be helpful for improving student outcomes. But in general, I don't think we'll ever be done at looking at the right level of staffing, on the specific campuses or across the system.
Well, staying flat is one answer, and going up is another answer, which obviously we don't probably think is the right thing. But are you at all saying that there's the consideration on the table to continuing decrease? Because as you've shown, the number of executives in the Great Recession, you have decreased. And so do you see that trend continuing, which many would say would be the appropriate course of action, but I'll leave it to you.
Well, I would say staying flat is actually a decrease given the increases we're seeing, in the university. I mean, one of the things that I would note, when you look at the medical center staffing, our medical center revenues went up by 50% during this period. And so, the fact that and contracts and grants went up not that much, but they went up by a large percentage. So the activities of the university are increasing, and so if we are pledging to keep administrative staff flat while that's increasing, we are getting greater productivity, and in essence are having a real decline in staff as weighed against those activities.
Okay, and lastly, just for. My curiosity, I could have asked you earlier, but Sales and services, that's almost as much as core funds. What do you mean by that? What are you selling?
Yeah, it's
$5 billion a year for the UC.
It's a good question. A lot of that is encompassed in the medical centers. It's the clinical plans and practices of the clinical faculty. That's also where we capture all of our auxiliaries, so all of the dormitories, dining halls, bookstores, athletics are sometimes captured in there. So it's a very
total profit, or
are they?
Or is it total?
No, that's just the revenues. That's not the.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's not the profit that's derived from it. But I'm happy to send you a breakdown because we have a granular breakdown of where those are.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions on this section, Mr. Ting?
So to Mr. Brostrom, the line item on page 4 around technical professional staff, I know LAO mentioned it, but there was a growth in over 1,000 employees in technical professional staff, 63% jump. So can you give us a sense of what these folks are doing, who these people are, why the large jump?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because it does warrant more. A lot when I'm talking about getting greater productivity is doing things that would require us to invest in some of these higher level professional staff. So this payroll system is a good example. It's called UC Path. We're doing it so eventually all of our campuses and medical centers will be on one payroll system. Of this 1,000, we probably have, last count, probably close to 250, 300 people who are working on that, most of whom would fall into this category. There's also been a growth in some things that we've taken in-house, so engineers, construction managers, lots of those kinds of things that previously we had outsourced. I can get we have the exact breakdown of what the different categories are, and would be happy to share that with you. But, largely they do reflect just things that we are doing with greater professionalization. It's happening across all industries.
And thank you for the explanation. But sort of given that logic, wouldn't you concurrently be able to reduce support staff? If you're sort of getting more highly skilled staff, wouldn't they be substituting for functions that are more clerical, but yet your support staff also grew by 1,000 people? While it's a small percentage, I'm unclear whether the university is actually becoming more efficient or they're just becoming more bureaucratic.
Yeah, that is really what you would see, is that the support staff would be flattening out or actually declining, and that is what's demonstrated over that period.
But it's not. It's the support staff grew by 1,000 people.
Yeah, but you have to weigh that against the growth in the overall campus, whether it's the student enrollment or growth in dormitories. I mean, there's lots of things that happen where you will need, for example, during this period. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but we brought on thousands of beds in dormitories, and so all those have a commensurate increase in especially in support staff, and so those would not be. That would reflect a real decline in some of the clerical and administrative staff, but maybe a growth in food service staff or others.
Right, but if the increase was, say, due to beds or dormitories, that would be offset by students paying for room and board.
That's right.
Right, so that would not be something that would have a general fund
That's
impact.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to get a better understanding of, what is really being impacted by the general fund, not something that's really off the books, whether it is sort of a housing function or whether it's a food function or whether it's a catering function. Those all sort of pay for themselves.
That's right.
What I'm concerned about is what additional costs are just purely administrative, and the fact that you have this, and I don't know if it's blended together or it's all one. All separate buckets, but to me, I'm really trying to understand what are the actual support staff impacts. For example, the types of projects that you just outlined, whether it's, engineering, construction management, IT, are sort of system-wide projects. The specific support staff function you mentioned are really things that are already sort of paid for by direct student costs.
Yeah. Mr. Ting, perhaps display 7 would be a good place to look, because you can see exactly what you're saying is demonstrated. If you look at the professional and support staff, there was an overall growth. That you'd identified 1,000, but you can see that on core funds, and that would be sort of the core funds for teaching and education. They dropped by about 3,500, and all of the growth plus the 4,500 occurred on non-core funds. So that would include things.
So where am I looking?
I'm sorry, in the far right column here on display.
The one where it says
7.
core funds. You had 7. This is general campus non-student prof/support staff. Is that what we're talking about?
That would be the what we call the PSS, the professional support staff.
Okay, so for the core funds, you had a drop of roughly 3,500
Yeah.
or so.
And there was a 4,500 growth in non-core funds,
right,
which resulted in the overall growth. But that goes to what you were saying, is that would be things that were growing on things like housing revenues or dining revenues or contracts and grants. On the core funds, which stem from the state and tuition, there was this decline, and you can see it actually did happen as well on the core funds. It grew on the PSS, but by a small amount. Most of it grew on the non-core funds.
But then, if all the personnel costs are decreasing on the core funds, except for, I guess, was it general campus non-student tech/professional?
Yeah.
Then why the increased need in budget then?
I'm sorry?
Well, you're dropping all these categories you're providing on core funds. You're seeing a decrease.
Yeah. And we have seen that. Our payroll was
right.
on general funds was basically flat. It was like
right.
5% over this whole period.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then the additional budget requests, I think it was $250 million. Where would you be putting that money then?
We'd be putting it almost entirely into increased enrollment, reinvestment in academic quality, so increasing faculty, and then basic mandatory costs for retirement, health benefits, our collective bargaining contracts. None of it would be going to administrative staff growth.
Okay. So you're saying none of the additional money is going to be going to administrative staff? Okay.
No, I mean there would be increases in benefits and increases in salary,
Sure,
but not
I understand.
Okay,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll proceed to the next panel. I assume the appropriate individuals up here. Okay, this is going to focus on the pension issue, which we discussed at length a couple of months ago, and since then, the university has given some analysis as far as the normal costs and so forth of the actuarials of the pension system. Gives some scenarios as far as what could happen if the UC stepped up and agreed to the wholesale pension reform that the rest of the state of California has already agreed to. No one heard any of that. So, okay, start over. So I'll just summarize that. Excuse me. So next we're going to proceed to the pension issue, and this follows up on the hearing we had a couple of months ago. And since then, the university has gotten back to our budget staff and provided some actuarials and normal costs and so forth as far as what the numbers are today and what it would look like if the UC had agreed to the pension reforms the state of California agreed to in 2012, which the rest of the state workforce has, but for the UC, and specifically the biggest issue we're zeroing in on is the salary cap for pensionable income. And as we see in the agenda, it is a significant a number that would be saved. Granted, it wouldn't be for a couple, 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But at that point, we can see that it's a couple $100 million a year that would be saved. And certainly we'll hear that many of those, more than half of that, would be through the medical system, and some of those are core funds and non-core funds. But nonetheless, those are tens of millions of dollars in the future that could be used for core academic support. And so as you proceed with your presentation, just want you to keep this question in mind, is that will the University of California stand with state and local governments who have agreed to this, we think, reasonable cap and bring some transparency and fairness to the pension system that we've already have here in California versus the 2012 reform. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair McCarty, and you gave a lot of my testimony for me, so I'll try to cut to the chase. But first of all, I really appreciate the chance to talk to you about this, and I just want you to know that we have heard what you and the other committee members have said on this, and we have spent a lot of time looking at it and modeling it, and we'll continue to explore it. I would remind you that we had started our pension reform before the state did. We did it in 2009. We went through an exhaustive process to make sure that the retirement plan would be fiscally sustainable and still be competitive with recruiting and retaining faculty and staff. In 2010, we approved several reforms, including the restart of employer-employee contributions that now is up to $1.4 billion in the coming year, and instituting a new tier that went into effect in 2013. And then we also did some internal borrowing to further solidify the plan. As the chair mentioned, the plan is almost identical to the plan that the state adopted, with the one exception that we use the IRS compensation cap and the state uses the Social Security cap. And in follow-up to that, as the chair mentioned, we did do the analysis of what our plan would look like if we did have the normal cost under the modified tier with the further pepper cap. And so I'll just refer to that. And I think the chair already noted some of the changes that I would say. Again, this is a hypothetical. The pension reform, whether for the state or the university, only affects new employees, and so it takes 25 years or longer for this to be fully realized. I'd actually asked for that analysis on when we got our existing tier, and for it to be the savings to be completely realized took 28 years. We were reducing our normal cost by 3%. It was about 10 years for every percent as new employees came on and existing employees retired. I would also note that this does reflect a large amount of savings, $256 million roughly. That would be, under our plan, would be split roughly between the employer and the employee. So that's about $128 million. And then, as the chair mentioned, about a third of that is on core funds. So it would be $42 million that we would realize in savings, again, nearly 3 decades. The one other issue that I would note, because I was confused by this and talked to Assembly, the staff, was even when we got our normal cost, it was still a couple points higher than the state. Ours was 14.7%, and the state was 12.9%. And so I asked our team to analyze it. They can't do it down to the penny, but the largest thing seems to be the average entry age for a member. Our average entry age tends to be about 3 years older than that for the state, which means there's less time both for contributions and benefits start earlier, and that results in the higher normal cost from 14.7% to 12.9%. That being said, these are all things that we have to keep looking at, both this and retiree health. Huge parts of our budget. This is $1.4 billion. Our health benefits are $1.6 billion, and so we continue to explore ways to rationalize this while still maintaining benefits for faculty. So happy to answer any questions on this.